Medieval battles were brutal and unforgiving. Some lasted only a few hours, others continued for days, and long sieges could drag on for months or even years. When the fighting finally stopped, the battlefield was left behind, covered with the wounded and the dead. Many soldiers were lucky and survived. Others were not so fortunate, slowly bleeding or suffering until their final moments. But what happened after the battle ended? Who helped the wounded, if anyone came at all? And who dealt with the bodies left behind on the field? This is what happened after a medieval battle. After a medieval battle ended, the fighting stopped, but the field remained full of movement and danger. Many of the wounded were still alive, lying exactly where they had fallen. Some were pinned under other bodies, others were unable to stand because of broken limbs or deep cuts. Those who could still move often lacked the strength to go far. Most injuries did not cause immediate death. A man could survive for hours with a serious wound, especially if the bleeding was not instantly fatal. Blood loss was often slow, soaking into clothing and the ground. In other cases, the injury was internal and the condition worsened gradually without visible signs at first. As time passed, the initial shock of the fight was replaced by physical collapse. The body reacted to trauma by reducing circulation. This led to weakness, confusion, and loss of consciousness. There was no organized system to collect the wounded. Medical care existed, but it was limited and selective. Knights and nobles had a higher chance of being found and treated because they had value. They could be identified by their armor, symbols, or better equipment. Common soldiers had no clear markings, and once they fell, they were often indistinguishable from the rest. Because of this, most wounded men remained where they were. If someone from their own side passed by, they might be recognized and helped. Otherwise, they were left on the ground, surrounded by the dead and dying. Bleeding remained the main cause of death in the first hours. Deep cuts could not be properly closed, and there was no effective method to treat internal injuries. Even when bleeding slowed, it did not stop completely. Over time, the loss of blood weakened the body to the point where survival was no longer possible. Arrow wounds added another level of difficulty. Arrows often stayed inside the body, especially if they struck muscle or bone. Many arrowheads were designed with barbs, which made removal more damaging. Pulling an arrow out could tear tissue and restart heavy bleeding. Leaving it inside increased the risk of infection and long-term damage. Infection became more important as time passed. Open wounds were exposed to dirt, blood, and bacteria from the environment. There was no understanding of sterilization. Even a smaller wound could become fatal after a few days. Fever, swelling, and spreading infection usually ended in death. Some wounded soldiers were eventually found and removed from the field. If they were still conscious and able to be transported, they could be carried to a camp or nearby shelter. Treatment was basic. Wounds might be washed, stitched, or burned with heat to stop bleeding. This process was painful and often caused additional damage, but it was one of the few available methods. As the wounded remained on the field, the first organized movement came from soldiers of the winning side. They returned to the battlefield with a clear purpose, moving between bodies and focusing on what could still be used. Weapons were taken first. Swords, daggers, and axes were collected quickly, often still lying close to the bodies. A well-made weapon was valuable and could be reused immediately or passed to another soldier. Many armies depended on captured equipment to replace losses after the battle. Armor required more time. Straps had to be loosened or cut, and some parts were difficult to remove without turning the body. If a man was lying face down or trapped under others, he had to be pulled free first. This often caused additional damage to the body, especially when speed was more important than care. Chest pieces and shoulder protection were tightly fitted. Removing them required access to buckles or ties that were not always easy to reach. In some cases, leather straps were cut to save time, making the armor less valuable but still usable. Helmets were easier to take. They were often removed first because they were accessible and quick to handle. If the head had been injured or swollen, the helmet could be stuck and harder to pull off. Dented helmets were still collected, as they could be repaired or reused. Boots were another important item. Good leather footwear was durable and required skilled work to produce. Removing boots could be difficult if the legs were damaged or stiff. They were sometimes pulled off with force, and in some cases cut open to speed up the process. Belts, pouches, and small personal items were searched for next. Coins were not always visible and had to be found by touch, often under clothing or armor. Rings, knives, and metal fittings were taken whenever found. Anything made from metal or leather could be reused, traded, or sold. This process did not depend on whether the person was dead. Wounded soldiers were searched in the same way. If they were too weak to resist, their equipment was removed without hesitation. Some were still conscious and aware, but unable to stop what was happening. After the first pass by soldiers, other groups entered the battlefield. Camp followers and civilians moved through the area more slowly and searched more carefully. They focused on items that had been missed during the initial collection. Small tools, buckles, fragments of armor, and damaged equipment were gathered. Even broken items had value, as metal could be reused or melted down. As more people passed through the field, the original positions of bodies changed. Bodies were turned, dragged, or shifted aside during the search. Some were moved several times as different individuals searched the same area. Higher-ranking individuals could still be recognized by better materials, decoration, or quality of equipment. If identified early, they might be separated from the rest. Their bodies could be recovered, or if still alive, held for ransom. Most soldiers had no such distinction. Once their equipment was removed, there was nothing that indicated who they were. Clothing was simple and similar across large groups, and without armor or weapons, individuals became indistinguishable. Within the first hours, the appearance of the dead and the dying was no longer the same as during the fight. Blood that had soaked into clothing and the ground started to dry. Open wounds darkened and hardened at the edges. Where bleeding had been heavy, the ground became sticky and uneven, mixed with dirt and debris. The body temperature began to drop soon after death. As it cooled, the muscles stiffened in a process now known as rigor mortis. This made movement more difficult for anyone handling the body. Limbs could become fixed in positions that reflected the final moments of the person. At the same time, the earliest stages of decomposition had already begun. Internal processes continued after death, breaking down tissue from within. This was not immediately visible, but it affected the body's structure and smell. In warm conditions, these changes accelerated. Heat increased the rate of decomposition and made the environment more difficult for those still present. The combination of blood, open tissue, and rising temperature created a strong and persistent odor. Insects appeared quickly. Flies were among the first, attracted by the smell of blood and exposed wounds. They gathered around the face, mouth, and any open injury. Eggs could be laid within a short time, especially in warmer weather. As hours passed, the number of insects increased. The smell became one of the most noticeable changes. It spread across the battlefield and into surrounding areas. For those working nearby, it was constant and difficult to ignore. Water sources near the battlefield were at risk. Blood, dirt, and organic material could enter streams or shallow wells. This created further problems for anyone remaining in the area after the battle. As human movement on the battlefield decreased, animals began to take its place. The smell of blood and exposed tissue spread through the area and attracted scavengers from a distance, often within the first day. Birds appeared first. Crows and ravens circled above the field before landing in areas with the least movement. They preferred exposed parts of the body, especially the face and open wounds, where access required no effort. The eyes, lips, and softer tissue were often targeted first because they could be reached without tearing through clothing. Their movement was quick and repetitive. They landed, fed for a short time, then moved to another body. As more birds arrived, they began to compete for space, pushing each other aside and returning to the same areas repeatedly. Dogs followed next. Some came from nearby camps or settlements and were already used to human presence. They moved directly between bodies and relied more on smell than sight. Unlike birds, they were able to pull at clothing and access areas that were partially covered. When feeding, dogs often stayed longer at one location. They could drag parts of clothing aside or shift smaller bodies to reach exposed tissue. This caused visible changes in position, especially in areas where bodies were not tightly packed. In regions with lower human presence, larger scavengers appeared later. Wolves or similar animals approached cautiously, usually during quieter periods or at night. They avoided areas with recent movement and fed where bodies had already been disturbed. Their feeding patterns were different. They focused on larger areas of tissue. This further altered the original positions, especially where the ground was uneven or soft. As the condition of the battlefield continued to change, attention shifted toward removing the bodies. This was not done out of respect, but out of necessity. The presence of large numbers of dead created practical problems. The smell spread into nearby areas, and the ground became difficult to move across. In some cases, local inhabitants or soldiers were ordered to clear the field. Large pits were dug close to the site of the battle. The location depended on terrain, soil softness, and available space. Soft ground was preferred, as digging was faster and required less effort. The process of moving bodies was physical and direct. They were lifted, dragged, or pulled by limbs or clothing. There was no consistent method, and speed was usually more important than care. In areas where bodies were densely packed, several could be moved at once. In other places, individuals were handled separately, depending on how they had fallen. Bodies were placed into pits without any specific arrangement. They were laid on top of each other, often in multiple layers. Orientation did not matter, and there was no attempt to organize them by identity or origin. The depth of these pits varied. Some were shallow due to time pressure or hard ground. Others were deeper, especially if more time or labor was available. Covering the bodies was often done quickly. Soil was pushed back into the pit with minimal effort to compact it. In some cases, parts of the bodies remained close to the surface, especially if the pit was not deep enough. Identification was rarely possible. Most soldiers had no clear markers once their equipment was removed. Clothing was similar across large groups, and distinguishing features were not recorded. Higher status individuals were sometimes treated differently. If recognized, their bodies might be removed before mass burial. They could be returned to their families or buried separately. For the majority, this did not happen. They were buried together without names or records. As bodies were removed or buried, the immediate visual signs of the battlefield began to disappear, but the environment itself was already affected. The ground had been disturbed by movement, dragging, and digging, and this changed its structure in noticeable ways. Soil in these areas mixed with blood, bodily fluids, and decomposing material. Where large numbers of bodies had been left or buried, the surface became darker and softer, especially after rainfall. Loose soil and organic matter created unstable ground that could remain uneven for some time. This disturbance became more significant when water moved through the area. Rain carried material from the surface into nearby streams or low ground. If burial sites were shallow or placed close to water, decomposition could affect these sources more directly. People living nearby depended on these water sources without any reliable method of testing them. Even when water looked clear, it could carry contamination from the battlefield. This made certain locations less suitable for use in the period after the battle. At the same time, insects that had been present on the battlefield began to spread outward. This created additional risk, especially in settlements close to the site. Animal movement also shifted in response to these changes. Some species avoided the disturbed area, while others continued to return as long as there was anything left to attract them. This altered normal patterns in the surrounding region for a period of time. The ground itself did not recover evenly. In some places, heavy disturbance and digging made regrowth slower. In others, the presence of decomposed material increased nutrients, leading to faster plant growth later on.